Hello, everyone. My name is Masha Pradanovic. I'm at the University of Texas at Austin, and it is 11 a.m. it turns out in Austin, Texas. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the speaker today, Professor Mohammad Sahimi. Professor Mohammad Sahimi is professor at the Department of Chemical and Engineering and Materials Science, and his degrees are in chemical engineering as well. His bachelor's is from the University of Tehran, and then he came to United States to the University of Minnesota to finish his PhD. And basically after that, he started working at the University of Southern California, where he's still a professor. He has had a long and very prolific career. He's published more than 400 papers, 4 books, and has received several teaching awards, as well as research awards, but the most important one, of course, is the InterPore honorary membership and lifetime achievements. So he's also has been Kimberly Clark, a lecturer for InterPore, and the talk that you're going to hear today will be part of that lectureship. His research interests are basically spanning everything that we do in porous media: flow, transport, reaction, absorption, deformation, in both porous media as well as fractured media. So he's really covering it all. It is my understanding that in this talk, he's going to basically cover multiple cases of things that he has worked on. So without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Sahimi for this talk.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody, anybody who is listening. I'm very happy and honored to be here. This is supposed to be a Kimberly Clark lecture, and I thought that I should talk about some of the things that I have talked about and then describe a couple of recent research problems that we have been working on. So I have basically had a long career in porous media, and I've worked on all types of porous media. Of course, most of us have worked on oil, gas reservoirs, sandstones, carbonate, and so on. But I've also worked on catalysts a long time ago and more recently. For a long time, for 25 years, I had a research group, I still do, on membranes. I have worked on print and label papers because in print and label papers, you need to coat the surface, and therefore the coating fluid hits the surface of the raw paper and penetrates into the structure of the paper. So you want to know what quality you get based on the depth of penetration of the fluid into the paper. We have also worked on landfills, which are basically larger scale porous media, except that they are far more complicated than, let's say, oil and gas reservoir, because there are all sorts of biodegradation processes going on in landfill. And more recently, we're working on porous material for gas storage. Over the past 10 years, I've also branched out to related activities. We have been looking at flow and transport in nanotubes. We have been looking at protein aggregation in confined media and diffusion and reaction in biological tissues, but they're all based on my experience with porous media and materials. So we do numerical simulation, and in collaboration with others, we also do experiment. So the problems that I've studied are single and two-phase flow. Of course, a lot of people, we are all familiar with it, both Newtonian and non-Newtonian. We have looked at diffusion, we have looked at dispersion. Dispersion was my thesis, but I've kept an interest in it, and I'm still working on various aspects of it. We have looked at adsorption. I mentioned catalysts. We looked at the activation of catalysts in 1985. One of my first papers as a faculty was a paper on the activation of catalysts, where I identified that the activation is a percolation problem, because in deactivation, you have undesirable products that cover the active sites of the catalyst, but also plug the pores. And therefore, after some time, the catalyst loses its connectivity, and therefore it's a percolation problem. We have used membranes for separation of fluid mixtures. We have done simulation for formation damage and filters, where you have particles suspended in a fluid flowing through a porous medium, and you want to know what happens to the permeability and other properties. More recently, we have been looking at deformation and swelling in relation to gas storage. And I have also had an interest in wave propagation, because what I was interested in was whether acoustic and elastic wave in oil reservoirs become localized, which means that their amplitude vanishes after some distance, and if they are, under what conditions, and what is the length scale over which the amplitude of the acoustic and elastic wave vanishes, which means that if you have a recording station which is farther from the localization, from the source of the wave, whatever recording that you make is basically noise. It doesn't contain any physical information. Long time ago, when I started my faculty job, I also worked on nucleation and propagation of fractures. And of course, there is a close connection between fractures and earthquakes. So in collaboration with geology people at USC, and in particular Charlie Samis, who is very well known, we also connected these two together and published several papers. Now, the question is what type of model we use. Well, it depends on what length scale we have. And of course, at the most fundamental level, we have quantum chemical or quantum mechanical calculation. These are basically first principle calculation ab initio, and density functional theory or Hartree-Fock theory. Then at a little larger scale, we have empirical force field that people use in molecular dynamics simulation. Then we have pores and grains, which means basically pore networks. Then we go to larger scale, where we use finite difference or finite volume or finite element type of computation. And of course, eventually at kilometer scale, we have to simulate field scale porous media. So it all depends on what scale you are working at. And therefore, what type of models we develop. The type of thing that I have been doing is reconstruction, which means that you have a certain amount of data, and based on the data, you try to set up a model that not only honors the data, but also provides accurate predictions. Now, you can do this at various scales. One scale that we have looked at it is at the smaller scale, atomistic scale, that I'll talk about in a minute. Then we also have molecular pore networks, which are like regular pore networks, except that the walls of the pores have atomistic structure, and therefore, as fluid passes through them, there is interaction between the passing fluid and the walls. Then you have percolation models that are all familiar. When I was a graduate student, I started with random percolation. Then later on, inspired by the observation that made by Tom Hewitt and others, that porosity and permeability fields in large scale porous media are actually quite correlated, I developed a correlated percolation. And then invasion percolation that others developed, but together with collaborators in Australia, we made it very efficient, and therefore is very good to use it now. We also work the regular pore networks, which are either hypothetical, just abstract, or we extracted from images. We also do simulation directly with images so that we don't have to make any assumptions. And then we reconstruct it, except that now we do it at much larger scale. And eventually we upscale these so that we can do at much larger scale. 4 problems that I have recently worked on. One is reconstruction at a smaller scale, as I mentioned. The other one is construction, that I also mentioned, and absorption and soiling of porous materials. The 4th problem that I won't talk about, because I thought I have enough time, but I don't, which is basically a unified approach to analysis of data, such as well logs, and then we construct a simulation grid for the simulation, and then we upscale it, and then the simulation of multi-phase flow in that type of system. But we do all of it based on one toolbox, which is wavelet and curvelet transformation. If you look at our most recent paper that was published last year in Transporting Porous Media, that has all the earlier references. In that one, we propose something completely new, namely we upscale geological models that have completely irregular grid structure. For example, Voronoi, and this is very difficult to do normally, but we develop a new type of wavelet transform, which is called lifting-based graph wavelet transform, and we succeeded in doing it. Okay, so let's look at the first problem, reconstruction at the atomic scale, which is quantum mechanical and atomistic simulation of nanopost membranes. This work was funded by DOE and was motivated by the fact that we want to produce hydrogen. Hydrogen is the most, there is no molecule or atom in the universe more than hydrogen, yet on Earth, if you want to have hydrogen, you have to actually produce it. And the way they produce it is by steam reforming. Namely, they put methane and water at high temperature in a reactor at about 1,000 degrees, and then that produces hydrogen, and then you have to separate hydrogen from the other gases that are produced during the process. And for that separation, you need a membrane. Now, since this is a high temperature conditions and also the reaction environment is highly reactive, the membrane should withstand high temperatures, but at the same time, it should be inert so that it won't react with other reaction products. So the way it's done is basically the way we developed the model. We wanted to optimize the performance of this, and the way it's done is we have a polymeric precursor. It goes under pyrolysis. It loses all the atoms such as nitrogen, oxygen, and so on, and at the end you are left with silicon and carbon. And then silicon and carbon react with each other and form a silicon carbide amorphous material, which is a membrane layer on top of the support. The support, I'm showing it on the right, so the support is another silicon carbide porous material, except that as a meso scale, so it cannot be used for separation. And then you deposit that membrane layer of silicon carbide on top. A good membrane should have high flux and also high separation factors. In other words, it should be able to purify, for example, hydrogen and separate from the rest. But high flux means very thin membrane, because as the thickness increases, the probability of having defects in the structure increases, and therefore you lose separation. On the other hand, if it is too thin, then it cannot withstand the high pressure that you apply during the operation. Therefore, there's an optimal thickness that you have to identify, and this is something that we wanted to do. So we want to reconstruct the model. Basically, we wanted to mimic the process that we do in the lab. In the lab, we made the membrane, and it was published a couple of papers about a decade ago. It was a very good membrane in the sense that it had very high separation factor. However, the flux was low, and therefore we wanted to optimize it. In order to optimize it, since the pores are too small and the hydrogen and other gases interact with the pore walls, we needed an atomistic model. An atomistic model requires accurate force field, except that this force field has to be reactive, because during the pyrolysis, a lot of bonds break, and then eventually silicon and carbon react with each other, and almost all force fields cannot simulate reaction. Therefore, we had to do this in stages. We have 4+1 stages of developing the model. The first stage is we develop the reactive force field. We call it REACT-FF. And then we use that to generate quantum mechanical data in order to supply the reconstruction process to build the data. Then we generate the polymer itself. Then we simulate pyrolysis using that reactive force field. Eventually, we get the silicon carbide, nano-amorphous silicon carbide membrane layer. And then we simulate diffusion and flow through the membrane and look at the separation. And if it is accurate, then we try to vary the parameter of the simulation to see what is the optimal structure of the membrane. Just to explain how it is done in any force field. You express the total energy of the system as sum of many energies. Any configuration in the molecular structure that costs energy to deform, stretch, or compress, for example, has a term here. For example, a bond can be a stretch, so that's the first term, E bond. There are van der Waals forces, two-body interactions, that's the second one. A lot of molecules are charged, and therefore there are Coulombic interactions, that's the third one. You can have two bonds that are connected to each other, and two bonds can deform with each other. So that's three-body term that you see. You can have four bonds, three, let's say, in one plane and one perpendicular. That's another one. And then you have multi-bond, an atom interacts with many of them. Sometimes the valence is less than what it should be, sometimes it's more than what it should be, and so you have to account for that. So you parameterize all these expressions, and this force field had 438 parameters that we needed to determine based on quantum mechanical data that we calculated. So we did that, and in fact, we identified the optimal thickness so that when we actually did the experiment, indeed, that was the optimal thickness. 4 papers were published. I have listed here, most of them in Journal of Physical Chemistry in between 2013 and 2015. The final structure of the membrane looks like this. We tested against experiment. For example, if you calculate the connectivity of silicon and carbon, you will see it's 3.6, whereas theoretically you expect it to be 4. So the question is, why is it less than 4? And how do we know that this structure is accurate? So we compute various properties of the structure. On the left, you see radial distribution function. On the top is computed. At the bottom is measured, and they see completely similar. And indeed, you see that in addition to have silicon and carbon bond, the main peak, you also have silicon-silicon and carbon-carbon, and that's why the coordination number, the connectivity is less than what it should be. On the right, you see X-ray diffraction pattern. Again, they computed on the top and the measure on the bottom. They agree, in particular, the location of the peaks, which is the most important thing, agree completely, and this was published in 2013. Okay, so that's reconstruction at the smallest scale. We can go to opposite scale and look at reconstruction at much larger scale. And we can, of course, not use molecular simulations because you're dealing with zillions and zillions of atoms. There is no way to do this. It's not also a new problem because many approaches have been developed over the past many years, and they have had varying degrees of success. Normally, these approaches that have been introduced, they have an energy function. The energy is basically the difference between the data that you have and the predictions that your reconstructed model provides. And you want to minimize it. And in order to minimize that difference, people use various optimization methods such as simulated annealing or genetic algorithm or another method. But normally they use 2-point functions. In other words, they look at one point, let's say at U, as you see, and then they collect statistics at another point at a distance h from that point. And so 2-point statistics, which are good, but they do not give you long-range connectivity information on long-range connectivity of the structure, which is the most important. Other people use a multipoint, and of course, this was originally developed by geoscientists that I have listed here. They don't use energy functional, but they use other methods. And then a new approach that was developed by Pejman Tahmasavi as his PhD thesis with me, which we call it cross-correlation based simulation. The first 3 papers were published in 2012 to 2013 that I have listed there. Basically, the way it works is that you have some data, let's say a digital image or some data. We represent the model that we want to develop by a computational grid, partitioned into blocks. Then for every 2 blocks, neighboring blocks, we also have an overlap region. The overlap region is for having a seamless transition from one block to another. Within each block, we have distribution of heterogeneities, various structures. And then we build the model block by block by using a raster path and move along that raster path, and it can be oriented in any direction. And then what we do is we stochastically sample the digitized image or the data and fill the blocks and then match it with the data. The way we do it is match the overlap region with the complete data set or the image that we have. In order to do the matching, we consider a Euclidean distance d between the digitized image and DEV, which is the sample of the data that you have picked for a given block. Of course, we want this to be minimum because you want to be as close to the data as possible. But if you expand that, you will see that the first term on the right side and the last term on the side are always positive, and therefore in order to minimize D2, you have to maximize the middle term. And the middle term is basically a cross-correlation function or a convolution between your data and the sample that you have taken, which I have defined at the bottom. So you want to maximize that correlation function in order to minimize the difference between the data and what you have sampled. So that's basically the idea. So let's say, for example, we put one block there, we put another one with overlap there, we take another sample there, we put it there, we continue like that, we go to the next row around the raster path, we take another sample, we put it there, and so on and so forth. So that basically generates the model until we fill it up. And we, as I said, we do it according stochastically and according to the criterion that I gave. So here are some examples. For example, on the left, you see the digitized image. We make, since it is stochastic, you can make several of them, or as many as you want. So I showed 3 of them. There is another one here. Then there is a 3-dimensional one that we can generate many of them. And also another one here. Again, you can generate as many as you want. And these are all very, very fast. For example, fracture pattern, this is actual data on top, on the left side that was supplied to us. And then reconstructed structure is shown below. And it only takes 7 CPU seconds to reconstruct that data with our method. So it's extremely fast and it's also accurate. To test the accuracy, we calculate various properties. For example, we calculate variogram in one direction and variogram in the other direction. But most importantly, we calculate the multiple point connectivity, which is different from 2-point connectivity. Multiple point connectivity is the probability that a given number of points in a given phase of the material are connected. So that is basically a measure of long-range connectivity. And as you can see, the black line, which is the data, and the gray line, which is the reconstructed one, agree very, very nicely. We have extended to various cases. There were some problems in the original method that we addressed it in 2 papers in water resources research. We have also extended to reconstruct granule material, shale formation. We have also used it for membranes and biological tissues. So all the same type of work. You have some data, you set up a model that honors the data, and then you use that model to make predictions. It has also been extended to non-stationary porous media, which is very, very difficult to actually reconstruct, and all the references are given there. The last problem, quickly, I want to talk about soiling and deformation of porous materials. And of course, this is a very important problem to many, many, many problems. Biological tissues, polymer network, geomaterials like soil, rock, and concretes, filtration process. But more recently, and it has become fashionable, CO2 storage and sequestration, because we know CO2, when you inject it into rock or porous medium in the presence of water, it causes soiling. And in addition to that, metal organic frameworks, which is a new class of materials for gas storage that are very popular now. The way we model soiling and deformation and at the same time absorption in this type of thing is we use a statistical mechanical formulation. We assume that the process is quasi-steady state. Therefore, we write the total energy of the system. The total energy has a fluid part, a solid skeleton part, and the interaction between the fluid and solid, which I have written. That interaction between fluid and solid has 2 parts. One is the compressibility, the second term where I showed it, and one is a direct interaction between atoms in the fluid phase and in the solid skeleton. Then if you write the total energy and minimize it with respect to displacement and the density, we get a set of simultaneous equation, one for density, one for displacement. So if you discretize your system and solve these two simultaneously, not only you get deformation and swelling, but you also get absorption isotherm. And of course, there are all sorts of data with which you can compare. And this formulation was first presented in 2017 in a paper in International Journal of Greenhouse Energy. One particular type of this material are metal organic frameworks or MOFs. They have crystalline structure. Basically, they are metals that are connected with polymeric network. There are thousands of them, all sorts of variation between them, and a lot of them have found very good applications. And in particular for storage of methane, carbon dioxide, and other gases. One particular one, which is named after a French institute, is called MIL53, has that type of structure. This is a very interesting structure because it goes under a phenomenon called breathing. Some of the pores, the cross sections of the pores contract, and then at some stage they expand. So it's just like human breathing, that you take some gases in and then you release it again. So your chest goes up and down. So this is breathing phenomena that you have narrow pores and large pores. And this is actually very difficult to model. Absorption isotherm looks like this. On top, on the right, you see the large pore phases, which that type of configuration. And on the left side, you see, on the bottom, you see the narrow pore phase, where the material takes that type of, and we want to model this. There are all sorts of data. The typical data, experimental data, is shown at the bottom. The structure that we simulated is on the right with different aspects ratio. One is a large pore and a narrow pore. They have different aspect ratio, and therefore they simulate the structure. We discretize the structure and we solve the governing equation that I showed you, and we get this type. And this is exactly what you see in experiment. You have a narrow pore at a low pressure, and then large pore at high pressure. Here we are showing CO2 adsorption and CH4 adsorption isotherm, and the transition between the two is also correctly predicted at various temperatures. In addition to that, we can calculate displacement, as I mentioned. So we calculate strain versus pressure. Again, at the bottom of the figure, you see the narrow pores. The strain is negative, which means that they have contracted. At the top, you see the large pores, which is basically the expansion of those pores. So you will see both of them, and with one model, we can predict all of it. And this was published in 2018. All right. So I would like to acknowledge, but I would also like to talk a theory that has been proposed. The theory was suggested by Rainer Helmich. And he said that there is an Iranian mafia in the area of porous media. And I want to provide experimental evidence for that theory. Problem one was done by Saber Nasseri, my student, Iranian. Problem two was done by Pejman Tamasevi, my Iranian student. Problem three was done by Sahar Bakhshan, another PhD student. And problem four that I didn't work on, there's a whole number of Iranian students that work on this. So there is some credibility to the theory that there is a porous media mafia, Iranian porous media mafia. Of course, I have had colleagues like Theo Satsis and Bill Goyer at Caltech and Philip DeVaros in civil engineering at USC. I thank you very much, and I don't think we have time, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody may have.
Thank you very much. So if there are any questions, you have a couple of seconds or so to enter one. I have already posed the question in session Q&A. Please ask questions here, so please ask a question. However, I do have one in store for you.
Sure.
So you have most recently also done some machine and deep learning for predictions of transport in porous media. What do you think is the biggest benefit of deep learning methods in upscaling or connecting all of these different model frameworks on different scales?
Well, I haven't done for upscaling, but well, in some sense we have for image enhancement and so on. I think if used properly, it can be very beneficial. The problem is that everybody has rushed into this field and everybody wants to be on the map. But when we talk about machine learning, there are various tools that we can use. And there is not a universal tool that we can use for every problem. And therefore, we have to choose that the method that we use carefully, depending on what type of problem. For the particular problem that you said, I think it could be very useful because, for example, for large-scale simulation, you don't have enough data. And you have certain places that you have data, but you practically know nothing in between, let's say interval zones. And therefore, it is where I can see how it could be beneficial to use that in order to get some idea about what's happening between the areas, where you don't have any data. So that would be one area where I think it would be very beneficial.
All right. There's one more question. I will extend the time a little bit just to ask the question from the audience. So the question is, what about conditional simulations with CCSIM?
What about?
Conditional simulations with CCSIM.
If you mean in reconstruction, conditional simulation, yes, the method takes care of that. If you have hard data, for example, that the model has to satisfy it, the method that I described can easily do that. What we do is we basically increase the resolution of the grid, computational grid, in the area where the hard data should be satisfied, and then we sample the hard data and we put the hard data there and make sure that this satisfies the condition for maximizing the correlation, the cross correlation function. If it doesn't, then we increase the resolution. The way we decide the resolution and what type of resolution we use is based on Shannon entropy. Shannon entropy is a measure of heterogeneity, and therefore you can use Shannon entropy to increase or decrease the resolution. And that's how we actually take care of conditional simulation in this type of reconstruction.
Okay. I will abuse my power as a chair to squeeze in one more question, even though we're a little bit over time. So the question is, thanks for the, it's not abuse if I announce it, right? Thanks for the talk. Could you also give us a hint on the wavelength part?
Yes, what we did was we actually, originally this started with the idea that if we have a finite number of data points, let's say along a veil, what is the most accurate method that can analyze the data and gives you meaningful information? Because some of these methods that people use, they have to have a large number of data. Some of them are very, very noisy. For example, when you calculate power spectrum of the data, they usually turn out to be very noisy. So it would be sort of arbitrary how to interpret the power spectrum because it's so noisy. So the original idea started by to address this question. And we showed that using wavelet transformation or calculating wavelet coefficients of the data, you get the most information from the limited amount of data. Not only that, we also showed that, and this was a paper about 23 years ago, and we also showed that if there is crossover in the data, which means that if you are in one regime and then you move to another regime, or if you are, let's say, in one area of the porous medium and you go to another area of porous medium, and there is a clear transition between the data, wavelet transformation easily detects that. Then we moved on to a single phase flow. Again, we asked the question, if we have a highly resolved computational grid like geological model, and we want to upscale it to a much coarser structure, how should we do it? And of course, this is not a new problem. A lot of people have done a lot of good work. And for example, your university, Lurovsky has done it. But what we did is we used wavelet transformation, again, based on the contrast between values of the properties between neighboring blocks. And we showed that it works very, very, very accurately and at very cheap computational cost. Then we moved on to miscible displacement, and then we moved on to immiscible displacement. And finally, the paper that I showed you was published last year in Transport in Post Media. We did the problem in which you start with a totally unstructured or totally random computational grid, which is, as far as I know, nobody has actually been able to upscale such models. And based on wavelet transformation, we develop a method which upscales the irregular grid to a coarser irregular grid, and therefore we can simulate this. And the good thing about, not that there is no method to do any one of these, no, of course, each of these problems has been studied by a lot of people. But the good thing about this is that we use just one method, and that's wavelet transformation, and we address all of these problems. So basically you have a toolbox of one, and then you can do analysis of data, construction of the model, upscaling it, and simulating it. And of course, wavelet transformation have been used in numerical simulation also. So this is basically a unified approach to all of these problems in one toolbox.
Thank you very much for these great insights. And I thank everybody who has attended this lecture live, and also those who will see it for up to a week, I believe, after this. And I hope to see everybody in person next year.
Yes,
so
of course.
I think 2021 should be the Edinburgh if we are so lucky. So see you, everybody.
Thank you very much.